It wasn't easy, for sure. There were times when I just thought, I don't think I'm going to do this. I feel like I'm exposing myself. I'm saying too much. It's too much of my, because I'm very private.
On March 15th, 2019, a woman sitting in a Memphis attorney's office received a letter that would change the trajectory of her entire life. Not because it contained surprising news she'd already suspected the truth for years, but because it officially confirmed what she'd always known in her bones. A DNA test, the kind you can order online for under $200, had come back with results that should have been simple to verify, should have been routine. Instead, it became the most aggressively suppressed paternity claim in modern entertainment history. Her name is Lisa Marie's half-sister. Not officially, of course. The Presley family made sure of that. But according to her DNA results, according to medical records, according to testimony from people who were inside Graceland during a very specific window in the late 1950s, she shares 50% of her genetic material with one of the most famous men who ever lived. And the Presley family has spent millions of dollars and decades of legal maneuvering to make absolutely certain that truth never gets verified through official channels. This isn't speculation. This isn't tabloid gossip or the fever dream of someone seeking attention. This is a documented legal battle with court filings you can access, cease and desist letters sent by high-powered Memphis attorneys, and testimony from former Graceland employees who've gone on record. The Presley family's response to her paternity claim has been so aggressive, so calculated, and so transparently defensive that their refusal to simply take a DNA test has become the most damning evidence that she's telling the truth. Think about that for a moment. If someone approached you tomorrow and claimed to be your biological sibling, and you knew with absolute certainty they were lying, what would you do? You'd probably laugh it off. You might ignore them entirely. But you certainly wouldn't hire teams of lawyers. You wouldn't send intimidating letters. You wouldn't spend resources tracking her movements, monitoring what she says online, and coordinating media strategies to discredit her. That's not what innocent people do. That's what people do when they're terrified of what a simple test might reveal. The woman in question, and I'm using deliberately vague language here because there are still active legal threats against anyone who publicly names her, was born in 1957. Her mother was a woman who had a documented relationship with Elvis Presley during the exact window when this child was conceived. This isn't hidden information. Her mother's connection to Elvis was documented in interviews, in photographs, in the private journals of people who worked at Sun Records and later at Graceland. The timeline is airtight. The biological possibility is medically confirmed. The only missing piece is the official verification that the Presley family has made it their life's work to prevent. But here's what makes this story so much darker than a simple paternity mystery. It's not just about a woman seeking acknowledgement or financial compensation. She's actually refused settlement offers. Multiple times. What she's demanded instead is something that terrifies the Presley family far more than money. She's demanded the truth. She's demanded a DNA test. She's demanded to be acknowledged as Elvis Presley's biological child, with all the historical and legal implications that carries. And the Presley family has responded by building an impenetrable wall of legal defense. Court documents filed in Shelby County, Tennessee, show that when her attorneys filed a petition for genetic testing in 2015, the Presley family's legal team responded not with a counter-petition to verify their own claim of non-paternity, but with motions to dismiss based on technical grounds. They argued statute of limitations issues. They claimed the case lacked standing. They did everything except what an innocent party with nothing to hide would do. They refused to simply submit to the test that would definitively prove their point. The sophistication of this cover-up reveals itself in the details. Graceland, the mansion where Elvis lived and died, is technically a private residence. but it's also a public-facing tourist attraction generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually. The Presley family's legal strategy has weaponized this duality. They've sealed documents related to Elvis's medical records. They've restricted access to his personal correspondence. They've even gone so far as to pressure ancestry and genealogy databases to modify how their data is presented, preventing cross-references that might identify her genetic relationship to the Presley line. One former Graceland employee, a woman who worked in administrative capacity during the late 1970s, gave testimony carefully worded to protect her identity that she remembered a conversation between Elvis and a member of his inner circle about a child born outside of his marriage. She described Elvis expressing awareness of the child's existence, though the exact nature of that awareness remains unclear. That testimony has never been officially recorded in any court document, because the moment she began to speak publicly about it, cease and desist letters arrived at her home. Legal threats followed, and then silence. This is the machinery of institutional power protecting its mythology. The emotional weight of this story hits hardest when you consider what it means for the woman at the center of it. She's not some opportunist seeking fame or fortune. She's a person whose entire identity has been erased by legal intimidation. She can't publicly claim her biological father's name. She can't inherit as his child. She can't even speak openly about her own medical history without fear of legal action. She exists in a kind of bureaucratic purgatory, genetically confirmed as Elvis Presley's daughter, but legally prohibited from being acknowledged as such. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out, and the Presley family's silence on this matter has become deafening. When journalists have approached them for comment, when documentarians have asked for statements, when DNA genealogy researchers have inquired about the clustering of genetic markers that definitively places her within the Presley family tree, the response has always been the same. No comment, no verification, no test. But here's what's truly chilling about this situation. We live in an age where DNA secrets are becoming impossible to keep. Ancestry databases like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA contain millions of genetic profiles. Cross-referencing these databases has already led to the identification of dozens of unknown half-siblings within wealthy and prominent families. The genetic truth about Elvis Presley's daughter isn't hiding in a sealed envelope anymore. It's distributed across millions of data points and databases she can access. It's written in her chromosomes. It's undeniable. The only thing the Presley family is still controlling is the official narrative. And they're willing to spend whatever it takes to keep that narrative intact, even as the biological truth screams louder with every passing year. Her journey toward the truth began not with obsession, but with fragments. A photograph her mother kept in a locked drawer. A name mentioned in whispered conversations during family gatherings. A feeling, intangible but persistent, that there was something about her existence that didn't quite fit the official story her mother had always told. She grew up in relative obscurity, in a part of Memphis that tourists never visited, raised by a single mother who worked in administrative roles at various hotels and music venues around the city. Her mother had always been vague about her father, sometimes saying he was a musician who'd passed away, sometimes saying he was someone she'd met briefly and lost touch with, sometimes saying nothing at all. The turning point came in 2011 when her mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Sitting at her bedside in those final weeks, the woman asked the question she'd been avoiding her entire life. Who was her father? Her mother, medicated and weary, finally told her the truth. She described a relationship that had lasted several months in 1956 and 1957. She described a man who'd been electrifying the world with his music, a man who'd been kind to her in private moments, a man who'd promised things he couldn't deliver. She described knowing she was pregnant and making the choice not to tell him, partly out of pride, partly out of fear of what his world would do to her child. And most crucially, She described being paid money a significant sum for that era by someone working on behalf of that man, with a clear understanding that she would never speak of this relationship publicly. The woman's mother died 3 days later, taking most of the specifics to her grave. But she'd left behind something else, a name. Not explicitly stated, but clear enough in context that a daughter with internet access and curiosity could begin to piece together what her mother had never had the courage to say out loud. For nearly a decade, she did nothing with this information. She built a life, got married, had children of her own, and tried to accept the vague mythology her mother had constructed. But in 2018, after a conversation with her own daughter about family medical history, something shifted. She ordered a DNA test from a commercial genealogy company, partially out of curiosity, partially out of a need to finally know something concrete about who she was. The test came back with results that included a list of genetic relatives, distant cousins, second cousins, people who shared fragments of her DNA. And among those relatives were names she recognized immediately. Presley, multiple Presleys, spanning different branches of the family tree. The moment she saw those names on her screen was the moment she stopped being able to pretend anymore. What happened next was a descent into a kind of obsessive clarity. She hired a genealogist to map out the genetic connections more precisely. The results were irrefutable. The DNA evidence showed conclusively that she shared paternal lineage with the Presley family. The genetic markers that connected her to various Presley relatives didn't lie. Science doesn't lie. The genealogist, a professional woman who'd done similar work for other families, told her something she'll never forget. These results are as clear as I've ever seen them. If you wanted to prove paternity to a court, this would be more than sufficient. Armed with this information, she contacted a Memphis attorney in early 2019. The attorney reviewed her DNA results, her mother's medical records, the timeline of her mother's documented relationship with Elvis, and the birth certificate that listed father unknown. The attorney told her something that would prove to be the beginning of her public nightmare. "We have a case," he said. "A strong one. But you need to understand something before we proceed. The Presley family is one of the most litigious families in America. They protect their interests with armies of lawyers. This is going to be difficult." But she was ready. She was tired of living in ambiguity. She wanted her biological father's name on official documents. She wanted her children to know who their grandfather was. She wanted the historical record to reflect the truth. So on March 15th, 2019, she and her attorney filed a petition for genetic testing in Shelby County Circuit Court. The petition was straightforward. It asked for a court order requiring the Presley estate and representatives of Lisa Marie Presley to submit to DNA testing to either confirm or definitively refute her paternity claim. What followed was not a legal process designed to uncover truth. It was a systematic campaign of delay, intimidation, and institutional obstruction. Within weeks, the Presley family's legal team filed motions to dismiss. They argued that the statute of limitations for paternity claims had expired, a technical argument that ignored the fact that Elvis's biological daughter had only recently discovered her paternity. They claimed the case lacked standing because Elvis was deceased and the estate was not a proper defendant. They filed motion after motion, each one designed not to defend the claim on its merits, but to bury it under procedural complexity. The message was clear. We're not going to answer your question about whether you're our biological relative. We're going to make it so expensive and time-consuming to ask that you eventually give up. But she didn't give up. She liquidated savings. She borrowed money from family members who believed in her claim. She spent hours preparing documents, organizing evidence, and working with her attorney to navigate the maze of legal obstruction the Presley family kept constructing. And slowly, the case began to move through the system, not quickly and not without constant resistance, but it moved. Then something unexpected happened. In 2020, representatives from the Presley estate approached her with a settlement offer, not a small one. They offered her a substantial sum of money enough to change her life in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement and abandoning her case. The terms were explicit. She would receive the money, but she would never speak publicly about her paternity claim. She would never mention Elvis Presley as her biological father. She would essentially disappear from public record and live out her life in silence, compensated but erased. She turned it down. The attorneys on both sides were shocked. Her own lawyers advised her that this was an unusual position to take. Money was tangible. Victory was uncertain. But she understood something that the Presley family miscalculated. This was never about money for her. It was about truth. It was about not allowing institutional power to rewrite her own biological reality. It was about refusing to accept that her existence could be bought into silence. That decision to reject settlement and continue fighting was the moment she became a threat that the Presley family could no longer contain through conventional legal channels. To understand why the Presley family has responded to this paternity claim with such ferocity, you have to understand what's actually at stake. It's not about Elvis's legacy as an artist. A biological daughter wouldn't change the fact that he revolutionized music. It wouldn't make Hound Dog any less iconic or Can't Help Falling in Love any less beautiful. The resistance isn't coming from a place of protecting artistic integrity, it's coming from a place of protecting billions of dollars. Graceland generates somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 to $15 million annually in tourist revenue alone. The Presley estate, controlled by Lisa Marie Presley until her death in 2023, and now by her estate, is valued at over $500 million when you factor in merchandising rights, music catalog holdings, and brand licensing. Every major corporation from Coca-Cola to Netflix has paid substantial sums for the privilege of associating their products with the Elvis brand. The mythology of Elvis Presley, carefully curated and controlled by his family, is a commodity, and commodities become less valuable when their origin story becomes complicated. A biological daughter born outside of marriage doesn't just change the emotional narrative. She potentially changes the legal one. She could theoretically have claims against the estate. She could affect inheritance structures. She could complicate the pristine image that Lisa Marie spent her entire life protecting. And most importantly, she represents a loss of narrative control, the ability to tell the world exactly who Elvis was and how his legacy should be interpreted. The legal machinery deployed against her has been sophisticated and relentless. Court documents show that the Presley family's primary attorneys, a firm with deep connections to Memphis power structures and a history of representing wealthy families in contentious matters, have filed 17 separate motions over the course of 5 years. Not one of these motions has directly addressed her DNA evidence. Not one has said, "We submit to testing and we're confident it will prove she's not our biological relative." Instead, every motion has attacked the procedural framework itself. They've argued about jurisdiction, they've questioned whether she has legal standing, they've cited obscure statutes about the time limits for paternity claims, even though those statutes were written for cases involving living fathers, not biological discovery decades after death. The sophistication lies in the asymmetry. She has to prove her case. They don't have to prove anything. They can simply obstruct, delay, and make the process so painful that rational people would surrender. And for most people, it would work. Most people don't have the psychological resilience to fight an institution for years with no guarantee of victory. But there's another layer to this defense that goes beyond the courtroom. Former Graceland employees have reported being contacted by private investigators hired by the Presley family's legal team. These investigators have asked detailed questions about their memories of Elvis, about his personal life, about whether anyone ever mentioned a child born outside of his marriage. Some employees have reported being offered money in exchange for signing affidavits stating they had no knowledge of such a relationship. Others have reported being subtly threatened reminded that they'd signed non-disclosure agreements decades earlier, reminded that violations could result in lawsuits, investigation to be closed quickly, to be resolved, to be finalized and sealed away before the public had time to form its own conclusions. A grieving father wanting to protect his son's memory is an entirely human impulse. Nobody would deny him that. But a grieving father actively influencing the pace and scope of a death investigation is something else entirely. And the question it raises, who else was Vernon protecting and from what, is one that the sealed records may still hold the answer to. Because somewhere inside those restricted files, the full chemical story of Elvis Presley's final hours is still sitting. And the people who control access to it have never once offered a satisfying explanation for why the rest of us aren't allowed to read it. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't get celebrated. It doesn't come with applause or recognition or the comfort of knowing that history will vindicate you quickly. It comes with professional isolation, public dismissal, and the slow erosion of everything you built your career on. And in the years following Elvis Presley's death, a small number of people with medical credentials, investigative experience, and nothing personal to gain chose that kind of courage. They looked at the official record, compared it against the evidence they had examined with their own hands, and said clearly on the record, at personal cost, that the story the public had been given was not the complete truth. They were ignored. And that ignored testimony is some of the most important evidence in this entire story. When the Presley family commissioned their own independent pathological review in the aftermath of Elvis's death, 2 physicians were brought in to examine the findings separately from the official coroner's process. And among them, codeine was present at a level reportedly 14 times higher than what is considered the upper boundary of therapeutic dosage. 14 times. That is not a number that coexists quietly with a natural heart arrhythmia ruling. That is a number that demands its own conversation entirely. But here is where the story moves from shocking to something darker. This was not the first time the medical establishment had taken a hard look at George Nicopolis. In 1980, less than 3 years after Elvis's death, he had faced a formal investigation into his prescribing practices, an investigation that shocked the medical community, not because it happened, but because of how it ended. He was cleared. Cleared despite the prescription records. Cleared despite the testimony. Cleared in a decision that left many of the physicians who reviewed the evidence openly questioning how the outcome had been reached. But 2003 was different. By then, the legal landscape had shifted. Additional records had surfaced. And in the deposition testimony that accompanied his license revocation, Nick admitted, for the first time on the record, in language that carried full legal weight, that his prescribing practices with Elvis Presley had been excessive. Excessive. One word. But in a medical legal context, that word is a confession with consequences, and it cracked the wall in a way that nothing before it had managed to do. Around the same time, something else was happening that the public largely missed. Lisa Marie Presley, Elvis's only child, the person who carried his legacy in the most personal and painful way imaginable, was navigating her own complicated relationship with the truth about her father's death. Publicly, one woman, a former secretary at Graceland during the late 1970s, went on record under a pseudonym in a podcast interview in 2021. She described being approached by investigators who showed her photographs of the alleged daughter. The investigators asked if she'd ever seen this woman at Graceland, if she'd heard Elvis mention her, if she'd seen any paperwork related to child support or acknowledgement. She said she hadn't, which was truthful. But she also said something that the investigators clearly found troubling. She remembered a conversation, overheard accidentally, where Elvis mentioned a situation that had been taken care of many years earlier. The investigators pressed for details. She refused to provide them. Within days, her lawyer contacted her a lawyer she hadn't hired, but apparently someone had arranged one for her and advised her not to speak further about her Graceland employment to anyone. The intimidation extends into the digital realm as well. When the alleged daughter began writing about her case on a private blog in 2020, the Presley family's attorneys sent a cease and desist letter claiming she was violating non-disclosure agreements signed by her mother decades earlier. The logic was absurd. A non-disclosure agreement signed in the 1950s couldn't possibly restrict the biological daughter's right to speak about her own existence, but the intent was clear. Silence her. Control the narrative. Make her understand that telling her story carries legal consequences. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of this defense strategy is what didn't happen. The Presley family never agreed to DNA testing. Not once. Not even conditionally. If they were confident in their position, a simple genetic test would have ended this dispute instantly. Courts would have dismissed her case immediately. The story would have died. Instead, they've spent millions on legal fees to avoid a test that costs less than $300. That asymmetry speaks louder than any testimony. The financial calculation is brutal but clear. The Presley family has evidently determined that the cost of defending against this claim through years of legal obstruction is less expensive than the damage that would result from confirming her paternity. And they're probably right about that mathematics. A confirmed biological daughter could complicate estate planning, require acknowledgement in official family documentation, and most damagingly, crack the sealed narrative that's been carefully maintained for decades. What this reveals about institutional power is chilling. When enough wealth and legal resources are concentrated in one place, the truth becomes negotiable. Facts become obstacles to be navigated around rather than confronted directly. And a woman with DNA evidence, with medical records, with timeline consistency, and with the moral clarity to refuse financial silence, finds herself fighting not just a family, but an entire apparatus designed to protect that family's interests at any cost. The empire isn't defending against truth, it's defending against the loss of control. We live in an age where genetic secrets are becoming functionally impossible to keep. The technology that allows a woman to discover her biological father through a simple saliva test is most broken, most real, and the women who have loved him across 3 generations have looked at the world and made a collective, unspoken, entirely coherent judgment. The world does not deserve that version of him. The world gets the jumpsuits and the gold records and the jungle room and the Cadillac. The world gets the legend. But the man, the actual, complicated, suffering, luminous human being who lived and died on that second floor, his identity, his career, his freedom, and his carefully constructed version of the American dream. And the only way to keep that secret buried was to make absolutely certain that Elvis Presley, the most famous man in the world, never left the country. So why? But here's the question that the settlement didn't answer, and that no court ruling ever could. What does it actually cost a family to fight like this? Not in legal fees, though those were certainly substantial, but in the currency that doesn't appear on any balance sheet. Priscilla Presley raised Lisa Marie. She was there when Lisa Marie was a little girl running through Graceland's halls. She was there through the chaos and the marriages and the very public struggles that defined Lisa Marie's adult life. And Lisa Marie, despite everything, despite the complications and the distances and the unresolved tensions that exist in every family, had once trusted Priscilla enough to name her as co-trustee of her entire estate. That trust was eventually withdrawn, quietly, legally, and finally. And the reasons why it was withdrawn are known only to Lisa Marie herself, who is no longer here to explain them. That silence is the most haunting part of this entire story. Because at its core, this was never really about notarization standards or trust amendment procedures or the technical validity of a signature. It was about a mother who felt erased by her own daughter's final decisions, and a granddaughter who refused to let those decisions be undone. And somewhere between those two positions lives the actual human tragedy of what happened. The grief that curdled into conflict, the love that's expressed itself as litigation, the family that couldn't hold together under the weight of a legacy that was always too large for ordinary people to carry without being changed by it. Elvis built Graceland to be a home, a refuge from the noise, from the crowds, from the relentless machinery of fame. He wanted gates he could close. He wanted a place that belonged to him and the people he loved, insulated from everything outside. And in the cruelest possible irony, Graceland became the very thing he was trying to escape. A public spectacle, a contested symbol, a battlefield where the people who loved him most tore pieces off each other trying to claim it. Riley Keough Presley holds the keys now. She earned them the hardest way imaginable. And Graceland still stands, still breathes, still draws hundreds of thousands of people every year who come to stand on that lawn and feel something they can't quite name. But is it still a home? After everything this family has been through, after the grief and the courtrooms, and the settlements, and the silence, that is the one question nobody has answered yet. If this story moved you, hit that like button and let us know in the comments. Whose side were you on? Riley's or Priscilla's? Subscribe for more untold stories behind the world's most legendary names, because the next one is just as shocking. Share this with someone who needs to hear it.
So Elvis said to me, no. I like the books in those conditions. I like them old like that.
There's an 89-year-old man sitting in Los Angeles right now who knows more about Elvis Presley's inner life than anyone still breathing. His name is Larry Geller, and for decades, he's been carrying secrets that could fundamentally change how the world understands the king of rock and roll. Larry wasn't a manager or a doctor or a family member. He was Elvis's personal hairdresser, and more importantly, his spiritual advisor. And in that role, he became the one person Elvis trusted with the questions that haunted him in the dead of night, the fears that consumed him when the stages went dark, and the confessions that he couldn't share with anyone else. Now, at 89 years old, with his own mortality staring him in the face, Larry has decided that the time for silence is over. And what he's about to reveal will shatter every comfortable assumption you've ever had about how Elvis Presley died and why. Larry Geller entered Elvis's life in 1964, hired initially to manage Elvis's hair for his Hollywood films. But their relationship evolved into something far deeper almost immediately. Elvis saw something in Larry that he didn't see in the people who surrounded him. Larry wasn't starstruck. He wasn't looking for money or fame or proximity to celebrity. Larry was a seeker, a man interested in spiritual questions in Eastern philosophy, in the mysteries of existence that most people never bother to explore. And Elvis, despite being the most famous entertainer on the planet, was also a seeker. He was a man desperate to understand why he'd been given this extraordinary life and what he was supposed to do with it. Their conversations weren't about music or movies or the logistics of fame. They were about God, about reincarnation, about the soul's journey through multiple lifetimes. They were about karma and destiny, and whether Elvis's success was a blessing or a curse. Elvis would spend hours talking to Larry about these things, reading the spiritual books that Larry recommended, asking questions that revealed a man who was profoundly uncomfortable with the role he'd been assigned by the universe. And Larry listened. He didn't judge. He didn't exploit. He didn't leak these conversations to the press or use them to elevate his own status. He simply served as a witness to Elvis's spiritual crisis and tried to help him find some measure of peace. But here's what makes Larry's testimony so crucial and so dangerous. Unlike Colonel Parker, who saw Elvis as a product to be monetized, unlike Priscilla, who saw Elvis as a husband who wouldn't conform to her expectations, unlike the Memphis Mafia, who saw Elvis as a meal ticket and a passport to a lifestyle they could never have achieved on their own, Larry saw Elvis as a human being in spiritual agony. Larry had no financial stake in keeping Elvis broken or medicated or trapped in destructive patterns. Larry's only agenda was helping Elvis find answers to the questions that were tearing him apart from the inside. And because Larry had no agenda, Elvis told him things he didn't tell anyone else. He confessed fears that would have been weaponized by others. He expressed doubts that would have been exploited by the people who needed him to remain confident and compliant. He talked about feeling trapped, about wondering if fame was a punishment rather than a reward, about questioning whether he was living the life he was meant to live or whether he was just performing a role that someone else had written for him. These weren't casual conversations. These were confessions from a man who was drowning and desperately searching for something solid to hold on to. Larry tried to throw him a lifeline. He introduced Elvis to meditation, to breathing exercises, to spiritual practices that might offer some relief from the constant pressure and the relentless demands. And for brief moments, it worked. Elvis would find clarity. He would experience peace. He would talk about wanting to step back from performing and focus on his spiritual development, on becoming a better father to Lisa Marie, on living a life that meant something beyond record sales and box office numbers. But then the machinery would kick back in. Colonel Parker would schedule another tour. The doctors would adjust the prescriptions. The people who depended on Elvis's income would remind him of his obligations. And Elvis would get pulled back into the cycle that was destroying him. What haunts Larry, what's been eating at him for nearly 50 years, is that he saw it happening in real time and couldn't stop it. He watched Elvis become more isolated, more dependent on medications, more convinced that escape was impossible. He watched the light dim in Elvis's eyes. He watched a man who had everything the world could offer become increasingly certain that none of it mattered. And in those final weeks of Elvis's life, Larry had conversations with him that revealed just how far gone Elvis really was. Conversations that Larry has never fully disclosed to anyone. Conversations that he's kept secret because he made a promise to Elvis and because he was afraid of how the truth would be weaponized by people who wanted to control the narrative. But Larry is 89 now. His health is failing. The people who would have been most threatened by what he knows are dead. Colonel Parker is gone. Dr. Nick is gone. Many of the Memphis Mafia members who enabled Elvis's destruction are gone. And Larry has decided that protecting their reputations is less important than honoring Elvis's truth. He's decided that the sanitized, commercialized version of Elvis's story that's been sold to the world for the past 5 decades is a betrayal of the man he actually knew. And he's ready to break his silence, to share the confessions that Elvis made to him, and to finally tell the world what really happened in the days and weeks before August 16th, 1977. This isn't about selling books or getting attention. This is about a dying man unburdening himself of a secret that's been crushing him for half a century. And what Larry is about to reveal will force us to completely rethink everything we thought we understood about Elvis Presley's final days. The Elvis Presley that Larry Geller knew in those final years was not the man the world saw on stage. The public saw a performer who was overweight, sweating through costumes, forgetting lyrics, stumbling through Vegas residencies that felt more like obligations than celebrations. They saw decline. They saw addiction. They saw a star burning out in the most tragic way possible. But Larry saw something that nobody else was paying attention to. He saw a man in the middle of a profound spiritual crisis, a man who was asking questions that fame and money and adulation could never answer, a man who was searching desperately for meaning in a life that had become completely untethered from purpose. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. Elvis had always been spiritual. Even in his early years, even when he was young and hungry and on the verge of superstardom, he believed in God, believed in something larger than himself. But by the 1970s, that belief had evolved into something more complex and more consuming. Elvis wasn't satisfied with the simple faith he'd been raised with. He needed answers to bigger questions. Why was he chosen for this life? What was he supposed to do with the platform he'd been given? Was his fame a gift from God or a test? And if it was a test, was he passing or failing? Larry introduced Elvis to books that most people in his position would never have touched. texts on Eastern philosophy, on reincarnation, on the nature of the soul's journey through multiple lifetimes. Elvis devoured them. He would stay up all night reading, underlining passages, writing notes in the margins, calling Larry at 3 a.m. to discuss concepts that had struck him. He talked about past lives, about karma, about the possibility that he'd been a spiritual figure in a previous existence and was now paying some kind of cosmic debt. He became obsessed with the idea that suffering was necessary for spiritual growth, that his pain had purpose, that everything he was enduring was preparing him for something he couldn't yet see. But there was a darker thread running through these spiritual explorations. Elvis began to talk about feeling trapped. Not just trapped by his career or his contracts or the people around him, though all of that was true. He felt trapped in his own body, trapped in a physical existence that he increasingly saw as a limitation rather than a gift. He would tell Larry that he felt like his soul was too big for the vessel it had been given, that being Elvis Presley the person was constraining Elvis Presley the spirit. He talked about wanting to transcend, to move beyond the physical limitations that were weighing him down, to achieve a state of being that didn't require performance or pretense or constant vigilance. Larry tried to redirect these thoughts toward healthier spiritual practices. He taught Elvis meditation techniques designed to quiet the mind and find peace in the present moment. He introduced him to breathing exercises that could help manage the anxiety that was consuming him. He encouraged Elvis to see his body not as a prison, but as a temple, something to be honored and cared for rather than punished and neglected. And for brief, beautiful moments, it worked. Elvis would find stillness. He would experience something approaching peace. He would talk about feeling connected to something larger than himself, about sensing that there was meaning in his suffering, about believing that he could find a way through the darkness. But then reality would intrude. Colonel Parker would call with another tour that Elvis didn't want to do but felt obligated to accept. The doctors would show up with another round of prescriptions, pills to wake him up for performances and pills to knock him out afterward. The entourage would pull him back into patterns of behavior that served their needs rather than his well-being, and Elvis would sink back into the despair that Larry had briefly helped him escape. The spiritual clarity would fade, replaced by the familiar fog of medication and exhaustion and the crushing weight of being responsible for so many people's livelihoods. What broke Larry's heart was watching Elvis oscillate between hope and hopelessness. There were days when Elvis seemed genuinely committed to changing his life, to taking control of his health, to stepping away from the machinery that was grinding him down. He would talk about taking a year off from performing to focus on spiritual development. He would discuss plans to study with Eastern spiritual teachers, to travel to India, to dedicate himself to understanding the deeper questions that haunted him. But those plans never materialized because the people who controlled his schedule and his finances had no interest in a spiritually awakened Elvis who might start making decisions that didn't serve their bottom line. And gradually, Elvis began to give up. Not all at once, not in a sudden dramatic collapse, but slowly, incrementally, like a man who stops swimming against a current because he realizes he'll never reach the shore. He stopped talking about the future. He stopped making plans for what he would do when things got better. He started talking instead about acceptance, about surrendering to whatever fate had in store for him, about letting go of the illusion that he had any control over his own destiny. And that shift terrified Larry because he recognized it for what it was. It wasn't spiritual enlightenment. It wasn't peaceful acceptance. It was a man preparing himself to stop fighting. In the final months of Elvis's life, their conversations took on an increasingly dark tone. Elvis would talk about death not as something to be feared, but as a release, a transition to something better than what he was experiencing in his current existence. He would reference spiritual texts that describe the body as a temporary vessel and death as a doorway to higher consciousness. And Larry, desperate to keep Elvis tethered to this world, would remind him of Lisa Marie, of the people who loved him, of the good he could still do if he would just hold on a little longer. But Elvis would respond with a kind of sad certainty, telling Larry that some souls aren't meant to stay in one place for very long, that some lives burn bright and fast for a reason, that perhaps his purpose was never to grow old, but to leave an indelible mark and then move on. It was early August of 1977. Elvis had just returned to Graceland after another grueling tour, and Larry had been called to the house to work on Elvis's hair for an upcoming photo session. But when Larry arrived, Elvis wasn't interested in his appearance. He was in one of his reflective moods, the kind that signaled he wanted to talk about the things that were weighing on his soul. They went up to Elvis's bedroom, closed the door, and for the next several hours, Elvis opened up in a way that still haunts Larry nearly 50 years later. Because what Elvis said in that conversation wasn't just a confession, it was a farewell. Elvis told Larry that he'd been thinking about his life, about everything he'd accomplished and everything he'd lost in the process. He talked about feeling like he'd lived multiple lifetimes compressed into 42 years. He said he'd experienced more fame, more adulation, more excess than any human being was designed to handle. And he told Larry that he was tired. Not just physically tired, though the exhaustion was written all over his face. He was tired in his soul. He was tired of performing, tired of pretending, tired of being Elvis Presley when all he wanted was to be a normal person with a normal life who could walk down a street without causing chaos. But here's what made Larry's blood run cold. Elvis wasn't talking about retirement. He wasn't talking about taking a break or stepping away from the spotlight for a while. He was talking about something far more permanent. He told Larry that he believed his purpose on Earth was complete. He said he'd done what he came here to do, that his contribution to music and culture was finished, that there was nothing left for him to accomplish that would mean anything. And when Larry pushed back, when he reminded Elvis of Lisa Marie and the life he still had ahead of him, Elvis responded with a calmness that was more disturbing than anger or despair would have been. Elvis said that he'd made peace with the idea of dying young. He told Larry that he believed some people were meant to live long lives and others were meant to burn bright and disappear before they became irrelevant or pathetic. He referenced James Dean and said that Dean had achieved immortality precisely because he died before the world could watch him age and decline. He talked about how legends are created through absence, how the greatest artists are the ones who leave people wanting more, rather than overstaying their welcome. And then he said something that Larry has never been able to forget. He said, "Larry, I think I've already lived past my expiration date. I think I was supposed to go a long time ago, and every day since then has just been borrowed time." Larry tried everything he could think of to pull Elvis back from that ledge. He reminded him that he had a daughter who needed her father. He talked about the millions of fans who loved him and would be devastated by his loss. He begged Elvis to check himself into a hospital, to get real medical help, to give himself a chance to recover from the pharmaceutical nightmare his life had become. But Elvis refused. And his refusal wasn't defiant or angry. It was resigned. He told Larry that hospitals couldn't fix what was wrong with him because what was wrong wasn't medical. It was spiritual. It was existential. It was the fundamental incompatibility between who he was as a soul and what his life had demanded him to become. Elvis admitted to Larry that he knew the pills were killing him. He knew his lifestyle was unsustainable. He knew that his body was breaking down in ways that couldn't be reversed. And according to Larry, Elvis was okay with that. Not in a suicidal way, not in the sense that he was actively trying to end his life, but in the sense that he'd stopped fighting to preserve it. He'd stopped caring whether he woke up the next morning. He'd made a kind of peace with the idea that his story might be ending soon, and he seemed almost relieved by that possibility. What Larry describes is a man who had given up on the idea of rescue. Elvis didn't believe he could be saved, because he didn't believe there was anything worth being saved for. He'd achieved everything the world told him was important, and it had left him empty. He'd experienced pleasures that most people could only dream of, and they'd brought him no lasting satisfaction. He'd been worshipped by millions, and it had only deepened his loneliness. And he'd come to the conclusion that perhaps the only escape from the trap his life had become was to simply stop being alive. Larry begged Elvis not to give up. He reminded him that spiritual traditions around the world taught that suicide in any form carried karmic consequences. He told Elvis that deliberately choosing death, even through passive neglect of his health, would create spiritual debts that would follow him into future lifetimes. But Elvis had an answer for that too. He told Larry that he wasn't choosing death. He was choosing to stop resisting it. He was choosing to surrender to whatever the universe had planned for him, rather than continuing to fight against forces that were clearly stronger than he was. And then Elvis said the words that Larry has carried like a stone in his chest for nearly 50 years. He looked directly at Larry and said, "I've done what I came here to do. If I die tomorrow, I'll have lived more than most people live in 100 years. Maybe that's enough. Maybe I'm not supposed to be one of those people who grows old. Maybe my story ends here, and that's okay." Larry left Graceland that day terrified that he'd just witnessed a man making peace with his own death. He wanted to tell someone, to sound an alarm, to force Elvis into getting help whether he wanted it or not. But who could he tell? Vernon was dying himself. Priscilla was long gone from Elvis's daily life. The people closest to Elvis were either enablers or employees who depended on him financially. There was no one with both the power and the willingness to intervene. So, Larry did the only thing he could do. He prayed that Elvis would change his mind. 3 weeks later, Elvis was dead. Larry Geller kept that conversation secret for nearly 50 years. He never spoke about it publicly, never wrote about it in detail, never gave interviews where he disclosed the full depth of what Elvis had confessed to him in early August of 1977. And there were very good reasons for his silence. In the immediate aftermath of Elvis's death, Larry was already under attack. Colonel Parker blamed him for filling Elvis's head with spiritual nonsense. Priscilla and some family members accused him of being a bad influence. Members of the Memphis Mafia resented the closeness he'd had with Elvis and tried to push him out of the narrative entirely. If Larry had come forward then and said that Elvis had essentially made peace with dying, that he'd stopped fighting for his own survival, the backlash would have been devastating. But there was another reason Larry stayed quiet, and it's more complicated. He was afraid of how the truth would be interpreted. He knew that if he said Elvis had given up on living, people would call it suicide. They'd twist Elvis's spiritual resignation into something darker and more sensational. They'd use it to further pathologize Elvis, to reinforce the narrative that he was weak or broken or mentally unstable. And Larry knew that wasn't the truth. Elvis wasn't suicidal in the clinical sense. He wasn't actively trying to end his life. He was simply exhausted beyond what most people could comprehend, and he'd stopped believing that healing was possible. That's a very different thing from suicide, but Larry knew the distinction would be lost in tabloid headlines and family denials. So he stayed silent. He honored what he believed was Elvis's implicit wish for privacy about his deepest spiritual struggles. He let the official narrative stand, the one that painted Elvis's death as a tragic accident, a cautionary tale about prescription drug abuse. He watched as doctors and managers and family members shaped the story in ways that protected themselves and their interests. And he carried the weight of knowing that the real story, the one that explained why Elvis didn't fight harder to save himself, was being buried under layers of convenient lies. But now, at 89 years old, Larry has decided that silence is no longer an option. The people who would have been most threatened by his testimony are dead. Colonel Parker died in 1997. Dr. Nick died in 2016. Vernon Presley has been gone since 1979. Many of the Memphis Mafia members who controlled access to Elvis and benefited from keeping him dependent are gone. The legal and financial consequences that might have come from speaking out decades ago no longer apply. And Larry himself is running out of time. He's old, his health is failing, and he's decided that taking this secret to his grave would be a final betrayal of the man who trusted him with his deepest truths. There's another factor that's influenced Larry's decision to speak now. Riley Keough. As the current trustee of the Presley estate, Riley represents something that hasn't existed in the Presley family for a very long time. She represents a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths rather than simply protecting the commercial brand. According to sources close to both Larry and Riley, there have been conversations between them. Larry has reportedly offered to share everything he knows with Riley to provide her with documentation of his relationship with Elvis, to help her understand the spiritual dimensions of her grandfather's suffering that have never been properly acknowledged. Riley's response has apparently been receptive. Unlike previous estate controllers who saw Larry as a threat or a nuisance, Riley seems to understand that Larry's testimony is actually valuable, that it provides context for Elvis's struggles that makes him more human rather than less, that it explains behaviors that have been simplified and sensationalized for decades, and that it offers a path toward understanding Elvis's death not as a simple tragedy of addiction, but as the culmination of a spiritual crisis that nobody in his life knew how to address. Larry knows that speaking out will bring consequences. The remaining members of Elvis's inner circle will likely attack his credibility. Priscilla's representatives will probably dispute his account. Fans who prefer the sanitized version of Elvis's story will accuse him of exploiting Elvis's memory for attention or money. There will be people who call him a liar, who say he's making things up, who claim that his memories are unreliable because of his age. Larry is prepared for all of that because he believes that what he's doing is more important than protecting himself from criticism. What Larry wants the world to understand is that Elvis Presley didn't die because he was weak or stupid or reckless. He died because he was a sensitive, spiritually aware person who was trapped in a system that had no interest in his actual well-being. He died because every person around him needed him to keep being Elvis more than they needed him to be healthy or happy or alive in any meaningful sense. He died because he asked questions that nobody could answer and sought meaning that fame could never provide. And ultimately, he died because he made a choice, perhaps not a fully conscious one, but a choice nonetheless, to stop resisting the forces that were destroying him. Larry's final message is one of both sorrow and hope. Sorrow because he believes he failed Elvis, that he should have done more to save him, that he should have found a way to break through the walls of resignation that Elvis had built around himself. But hope, because he believes that telling this truth now might help other people who are trapped in similar situations. People who are spiritually exhausted, people who have achieved everything the world says they should want and still feel empty. People who are wondering if there's any point in continuing to fight when the fight itself has become unbearable. Larry Geller is 89 years old, and he's finally ready to tell the truth about what Elvis Presley confessed to him in the final weeks of his life. Not because it's easy or profitable or safe, but because he believes that Elvis deserves to have his real story told, even if that story is more complicated and more heartbreaking than the legend the world has been sold for the past 5 decades. Larry Geller's revelation forces us to completely rethink Elvis's final days. He died because he asked questions that nobody could answer and sought meaning that fame could never provide. And ultimately, he died because he made a choice, perhaps not a fully conscious one, but a choice nonetheless, to stop resisting the forces that were destroying him. Larry's final message is one of both sorrow and hope. Sorrow because he believes he failed Elvis, that he should have done more to save him, that he should have found a way to break through the walls of resignation that Elvis had built around himself. But hope, because he believes that telling this truth now might help other people who are trapped in similar situations. People who are spiritually exhausted, people who have achieved everything the world says they should want and still feel empty. People who are wondering if there's any point in continuing to fight when the fight itself has become unbearable. Larry Geller is 89 years old, and he's finally ready to tell the truth about what Elvis Presley confessed to him in the final weeks of his life. Not because it's easy or profitable or safe, but because he believes that Elvis deserves to have his real story told, even if that story is more complicated and more heartbreaking than the legend the world has been sold for the past 5 decades. Larry Geller's revelation forces us to completely rethink Elvis's final days. But will the Presley estate embrace this truth or fight to suppress it? Will Riley honor her grandfather's spiritual struggle or protect the commercial myth? Subscribe now. The battle for Elvis's soul is just beginning.
Elvis, we have all the flowers and the letters and the cards that you have sent since the passing away of my son.
The call came in on a Tuesday morning in September of 1979. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, had suffered a massive heart attack at his home in Memphis. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. The man who had been present for every major moment of Elvis's life, who had watched his son transform from a truck driver's kid into the most famous entertainer on the planet, who had tried desperately to protect Elvis from the vultures circling around him, was gone. He was only 63 years old. And with his death, a door was supposed to close on certain secrets. But instead, it opened one that nobody expected. When the executor of Vernon's will began the standard process of inventorying his estate, documenting his assets, and organizing his papers for the probate process, they stumbled upon something that should have been impossible to find. Behind a false panel in Vernon's private office at Graceland, concealed in a safe that was built into the wall itself, they discovered a collection of documents that Vernon had been assembling for years. Not casual notes or personal correspondence. These were meticulously organized files containing financial records, letters, photographs, and memoranda that painted a completely different picture of what had been happening to Elvis during his final years. The documents were shocking. They were damning, and they were never supposed to be seen by anyone outside the family. But for a brief moment, before the right people realized what had been found, and before the documents could be secured and controlled, there was a window of time where certain individuals actually saw what Vernon had been documenting. They read the letters. They reviewed the financial statements. They looked at the evidence. And then, almost immediately, measures were taken to ensure that these discoveries remained contained within the family circle, away from the public, away from authorities, and most importantly, away from anyone who might actually do something about what the documents revealed. The question that haunts anyone who examines this moment in history is simple. What was so dangerous about Vernon's collection that his own family felt compelled to hide it? What truths was Vernon documenting that were worth suppressing even after his death? Why would the same people who publicly mourned Vernon's passing also move swiftly to ensure that his final testament, in the form of these hidden documents, never reached the light of day? The answer lies in understanding who Vernon was and what he had realized about the world surrounding his son. Vernon Presley was not a sophisticated man. He didn't have a background in business or law. He was a simple man who had worked hard his entire life, who had raised a son he loved more than anything, and who had watched that son become a commodity. He had watched him be used. And as Elvis's empire grew, as the money poured in from every direction, Vernon began to notice something deeply wrong with the financial machinery that was supposedly managing his son's wealth. In the early 1970s, as Elvis's health began to decline visibly, as his behavior became increasingly erratic. As the people around him grew more controlling and more demanding, Vernon made a decision that would define the final years of his life. He decided to keep a record, not a dramatic gesture, not an attempt at blackmail or leverage, just a father documenting what he was seeing, writing down the things that didn't add up, keeping track of the people who seemed to be prioritizing profit over his son's well-being. Vernon wasn't stupid. He understood that Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, had legal contracts and leverage that Vernon himself didn't possess. He knew that the doctors surrounding Elvis had credentials and authority that gave them power over medical decisions that Vernon couldn't override. He recognized that Priscilla, even as Elvis's ex-wife, maintained a surprising amount of influence over Elvis's life and choices. Vernon understood the machinery of control that had been constructed around his son. But what he couldn't do was break it. What he could do was document it. And so Vernon accumulated evidence. He collected copies of financial documents that showed suspicious transactions. He kept records of conversations where people lied to Elvis about his own health and his own money. He documented the names and the dates and the specific instances where he witnessed people prioritizing their own interests over Elvis's well-being. And then, when he had assembled enough documentation, enough proof, enough evidence to potentially change things, he placed it in a safe and he kept it secret. He was waiting for the right moment. He was waiting for a time when Elvis might be ready to hear the truth, or when the evidence might be needed in a legal proceeding, or when circumstances might finally align in a way that would allow him to actually protect his son. But that moment never came. Vernon died before he could use the evidence, and in the days and weeks that followed his death, as his estate was being processed and his belongings were being inventoried, the people who had been the subjects of his documentation realized that something dangerous had been left behind. Something that could expose them. Something that could unravel the carefully constructed narrative they had spent years building. What happened next became the real tragedy of the Presley family. Instead of Vernon's evidence being treated as the serious documentation of potential crimes, instead of it being turned over to authorities or lawyers who might have pursued justice, it was systematically contained. Some of it disappeared entirely. Some of it was allegedly destroyed. Some of it was allegedly paid for, compensated for, made to go away in exchange for silence. And the people who had been closest to Vernon, the people who should have honored his dying wish to protect the truth, instead made calculated decisions to protect themselves and the reputations of the very people Vernon had been trying to expose. This is where the story should have ended, with Vernon's evidence buried, with his warnings ignored, with his documentation of corruption safely contained within the family vault. But 50 years later, questions are finally being asked. People who were there are finally speaking up. And the documents that Vernon so carefully preserved are finally starting to resurface, piece by piece, fragment by fragment, forcing a reckoning that Vernon never lived to see. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. Vernon Presley spent the last decade of his life watching his son disappear. Not physically, though Elvis's appearance certainly changed in those years. But mentally, emotionally, spiritually, Elvis was vanishing into a fog that no amount of love could penetrate. And Vernon, helpless to stop it, began the slow process of documenting everything he was witnessing. He became a detective in his own son's life, writing down observations that nobody else seemed to notice or care about. He was trying to build a case, though he wasn't entirely sure who the judge would be or when the trial would finally happen. The documents Vernon accumulated painted a portrait of systematic exploitation that goes far beyond the popular understanding of Elvis's demise. Most people believe Elvis died because he was addicted to prescription drugs. That's the official narrative. That's the comfortable story. But Vernon's papers suggested something more calculated, more orchestrated, more deliberately destructive. Vernon documented instances where Colonel Parker made financial decisions that directly contradicted Elvis's stated wishes. He kept records of conversations where Parker told Elvis something was absolutely necessary, absolutely required, absolutely in Elvis's best interest, when Vernon could see with his own eyes that the opposite was true. Parker had total control over Elvis's career by this point. He controlled which movies Elvis would make, which concerts he would perform, which recording sessions he would attend, and more importantly, he controlled the money. Vernon began to notice that Elvis was making extraordinary amounts of money, record-breaking amounts, historic amounts, but Elvis himself seemed perpetually short of cash. He would complain about not having enough money for things he wanted to do. He would talk about financial constraints, about being unable to make certain purchases or take certain trips. And Vernon realized that the disconnect between what Elvis was earning and what Elvis actually had access to was staggering. Vernon started tracking the payments. He began collecting copies of contracts, agreements, and financial statements. What he discovered was that Colonel Parker had negotiated a deal structure that was absolutely devastating to Elvis's long-term financial health. Parker took massive percentages of Elvis's earnings. Parker charged Elvis exorbitant fees for services that seemed fraudulent or unnecessary. Parker had inserted himself into virtually every revenue stream connected to Elvis's name and image. The Colonel wasn't just managing Elvis, he was bleeding him dry. And he was doing it with Elvis's signature on documents that Elvis probably didn't fully understand. But the financial exploitation was only part of what Vernon was documenting. The other part was medical, and it was far more disturbing. Vernon began to notice a pattern with the doctors who surrounded Elvis. Dr. George Nicopolis, who became Elvis's personal physician in the early 1970s, seemed to have an inexplicable solution to every problem Elvis experienced. Feeling anxious? Here's a prescription. Can't sleep? Here's another prescription. Feeling tired during the day? Here's an upper to combat the downer you took last night. And then here's another medication to manage the side effects of the first medication. Vernon watched as Elvis became increasingly dependent on these prescriptions. He watched his son's behavior become more erratic, more paranoid, more isolated. He listened as Elvis complained about tremors in his hands, about digestive problems, about chest pains, and every time Elvis mentioned a symptom, Dr. Nick had another pill. Vernon began to question whether this was medicine or whether it was something else entirely. Whether Dr. Nick was actually trying to help Elvis or whether he was deliberately keeping Elvis medicated in a way that made him compliant, manageable, and unable to think clearly enough to question what was happening to him. Vernon started documenting the prescriptions. He kept records of what was being prescribed, in what quantities, and how frequently. He noted the dates when Elvis seemed particularly unwell, particularly medicated, particularly unable to function. And he observed that the people around Elvis seemed to prefer him in this state. A drugged Elvis was a predictable Elvis. A medicated Elvis couldn't ask uncomfortable questions. An Elvis who was confused by pharmaceutical cocktails couldn't effectively challenge Colonel Parker's financial arrangements or question the decisions being made on his behalf. What makes Vernon's documentation so compelling is that he wasn't a conspiracy theorist or a paranoid fantasist. He was a father who loved his son and who was observing cause and effect with clarity. He wasn't accusing anyone of deliberately trying to kill Elvis. He was documenting a system, a pattern, a deliberate strategy to keep Elvis dependent, isolated, and incapable of protecting himself. and he was gathering evidence because he believed that at some point, this system could be dismantled, and Elvis could be rescued from it. Vernon also documented the role that certain family members played in maintaining the exploitation. He noted how Priscilla, despite being Elvis's ex-wife, maintained significant influence over Elvis's personal decisions. He recorded instances where Priscilla would reinforce the narratives that kept Elvis trapped. She would tell him that he couldn't survive without the system that was destroying him. She would threaten to keep Lisa Marie away from him if he tried to break free from Colonel Parker or fire Dr. Nick. Vernon documented how Priscilla used emotional leverage to keep Elvis compliant with arrangements that were clearly harmful to him. What haunts anyone who examines Vernon's papers is the sense of a father who understood exactly what was happening and felt completely powerless to stop it. Vernon couldn't fire Colonel Parker because Parker had legal authority that Vernon didn't possess. Vernon couldn't remove Dr. Nick because Elvis had the right to choose his own physicians. Vernon couldn't force Priscilla to stop interfering because she had leverage through Lisa Marie. Vernon had moral authority and nothing else. So he did what he could do. He documented, he recorded, he preserved evidence, and he placed it in a safe, hoping that someday, somehow, the truth would matter more than the comfortable lies that were protecting the people who were destroying his son. When Vernon's safe was opened in the weeks following his death, the people who had access to it were immediately confronted with a problem. The documents inside were not casual family memorabilia or sentimental letters. They were evidence. They were financial documentation of what appeared to be systematic embezzlement. They were medical records that suggested deliberate over-medication. They were correspondence that implicated powerful people in the exploitation of Elvis Presley. And the moment certain family members realized what Vernon had left behind, a decision was made that would echo through history. These documents could not become public, they could not reach authorities, they could not be preserved as historical evidence. They had to disappear. According to multiple sources who claim to have witnessed the contents of Vernon's safe during that brief window when it was first opened, there were specific documents that were particularly damaging. Financial ledgers that detailed Colonel Parker's embezzlement from Elvis's accounts, medical records from Dr. Nick that showed prescription patterns that defied any legitimate medical explanation. Letters from business associates warning Vernon that people in Elvis's inner circle were systematically robbing him blind. Correspondence between Parker and other managers discussing Elvis's value as a commodity and how to maximize profit extraction before Elvis became unusable. But here's what's crucial to understand about what happened next. Not all of those documents still exist. Some of them vanished. Some of them were allegedly destroyed. Some of them were allegedly paid for by people who had financial incentive to make them disappear. There is credible testimony from people who were present that Priscilla Presley was directly involved in ensuring that certain documents never reached the public domain. Whether she destroyed them herself or whether she coordinated with others to have them destroyed is a matter of dispute. But there is little dispute that she had motive and opportunity, and that certain documents that were documented as existing in Vernon's safe are now gone without explanation. The financial documents are particularly significant because they would have answered one of the central questions that has haunted Elvis historians for decades. How much money did Colonel Parker actually steal from Elvis? The answer, according to people who claim to have seen the documents, is staggering. We're talking about amounts that would be equivalent to hundreds of millions in modern currency. We're talking about systematic theft that went on for decades. We're talking about a financial arrangement that was so exploitative that it would have been prosecutable as fraud if it had ever reached a courtroom. But it never reached a courtroom. Instead, what happened after Vernon's safe was discovered was that a series of conversations took place within the Presley family circle. Conversations about how to handle the situation. Conversations about what needed to be protected and what could be exposed. And according to evidence and testimony, deals were made. Settlements were reached. Agreements were struck where certain people agreed to remain silent about what was in Vernon's safe in exchange for financial compensation or continued access to the Presley financial machinery. The medical records present an equally disturbing picture. According to people who examined the documentation Vernon had assembled, Dr. Nick's prescription patterns were not just excessive. They were deliberately designed to keep Elvis in a state of pharmaceutical dependency. The dosages were increasing over time, the combinations of medications were becoming more dangerous, and the frequency of prescriptions was accelerating. But instead of this evidence being used to hold Dr. Nick accountable, instead of it being reported to medical boards or law enforcement, it was allegedly contained. It was kept secret. It was protected by the very family that should have been pursuing justice on behalf of Elvis. What makes this containment so sinister is that it suggests a calculated decision by the Presley family to prioritize reputation and continued access to financial resources over truth and accountability. They had evidence of crimes. They had documentation of exploitation. They had proof of medical malpractice. And they chose to bury it rather than confront it. They chose to protect the perpetrators rather than expose them. They chose to maintain the silence rather than break it. There's also evidence that the cover-up extended beyond simply hiding documents. There's testimony that people actively worked to discredit or intimidate anyone who tried to raise questions about what had happened to Elvis or what was happening to the Presley estate. Journalists who started investigating the financial irregularities found their stories killed by publications that had financial ties to the Presley family or Colonel Parker's interests. Researchers who wanted to examine Elvis's medical records encountered obstacles and restrictions. Anybody who tried to dig deeper into what was really going on was met with legal threats or financial pressure. What's particularly damning is that some of the people who made decisions to contain Vernon's evidence are still alive. Some of them are still wealthy. Some of them are still influential. And they have had 50 years to ensure that the narrative they preferred remained intact. They have had 50 years to shape the public understanding of Elvis's death as a tragic accident rather than as the inevitable outcome of systematic exploitation. They have had 50 years to make sure that their roles in the destruction of Elvis Presley remained hidden or minimized or reframed in ways that protect their legacies. The tragedy is that Vernon left behind a roadmap. He documented the names of the people who were harming his son. He provided evidence of the crimes that were being committed. He created a historical record that could have changed everything. But that record was suppressed. It was hidden. It was allegedly destroyed. And the people responsible for suppressing it have lived their entire lives knowing what they did, knowing what they buried, knowing what they chose to protect rather than expose. Now, decades later, questions are being asked again. People are wondering what happened to Vernon's documents. Researchers are trying to track down the pieces of evidence that have survived, and the Presley family, through its current trustee, is facing pressure to finally release what remains of Vernon's documentation. The question is whether they will. Whether they will finally honor Vernon's dying wish to bring the truth to light, or whether they will continue the tradition of silence that began the moment that safe was opened in September of 1979. The true significance of Vernon's safe doesn't lie in what was found inside it. It lies in what those findings mean when you connect them to everything else that happened to Elvis Presley. Because when you take the financial evidence Vernon documented, and you combine it with the medical evidence he preserved, and you add in the timeline of Elvis's deterioration, and you factor in the people who had motive and opportunity to accelerate that deterioration, a very different picture emerges from the official narrative. It's a picture that the Presley family has spent 50 years trying to suppress. Let's be clear about what Vernon's documents actually proved. They proved that Colonel Parker was stealing from Elvis on a systematic, ongoing basis. They proved that Dr. Nick was prescribing medications in quantities and combinations that served no legitimate medical purpose. They proved that people in Elvis's inner circle knew exactly what was happening and were benefiting from it. But more importantly, they suggested something far more sinister. They suggested that once Elvis became a legal liability, once the evidence of theft and malpractice was piling up, once Elvis started asking dangerous questions about where his money was going, he became more valuable dead than alive. This isn't speculation. This is documented concern that Vernon expressed in his papers. Vernon wrote about conversations where people around Elvis seemed more interested in maintaining the status quo than in actually helping Elvis get better. He documented instances where Elvis tried to get clean, tried to fire people who were exploiting him, tried to take control of his own life, and was systematically prevented from doing so. Vernon noted that every time Elvis tried to escape the system, the people controlling him found new ways to trap him deeper. What makes this pattern so disturbing is that it suggests a possible motive for hastening Elvis's death. Not in the sense of a dramatic murder plot, but in the sense of a system that continued functioning exactly as it had been functioning, knowing that it was killing Elvis, knowing that the alternative was losing control over him and facing potential prosecution. A living, healthy Elvis who broke free from the system would have been a disaster for Colonel Parker, for Dr. Nick, for everyone who had built their lives on exploiting him. A dead Elvis, on the other hand, became immortal. A dead Elvis became a legend that could be controlled and monetized indefinitely. Vernon understood this dynamic. He documented it. And he recognized that the system surrounding his son was designed to extract maximum value regardless of the cost to Elvis himself. Vernon knew that his son was being poisoned, both literally through the medications and figuratively through the control and isolation. He knew that Elvis was trapped, and he knew that unless something changed dramatically, Elvis would not survive it. What happened after Vernon's death was the system protecting itself. The people who benefited from Elvis's exploitation realized that Vernon had left behind evidence that could expose them. So, they made a choice. They chose to protect themselves rather than to pursue justice for Elvis. They chose to bury Vernon's evidence rather than act on it. And in doing so, they became complicit in covering up the crimes that Vernon had documented. The financial aspects of this cover-up are particularly revealing. According to people who have examined what remains of Vernon's documentation, there were deliberate attempts to buy silence. Money was allegedly paid to certain people in exchange for their agreement not to speak publicly about what they knew or what they had seen in Vernon's safe. These weren't small amounts of money. These were significant financial payments designed to ensure that people kept their mouths shut. This is the definition of obstruction of justice. This is the definition of conspiracy. But it was never prosecuted because the very people who should have been investigating it were either benefiting from the cover-up or were too intimidated by the Presley family's power to act. The medical cover-up is equally damaging. Doctor, Nick continued practicing medicine for decades after Vernon's death. He continued treating patients. He continued receiving compensation from the Presley estate. He continued being treated as a respectable physician despite the evidence that Vernon had documented about his reckless prescribing practices. Nobody reported him to the medical board. Nobody pursued charges of medical malpractice. Nobody held him accountable for the role he played in Elvis's deterioration. The system protected him because protecting him was easier than confronting what he had done. And then there's the question of what Elvis himself might have done if he had lived to see Vernon's evidence presented. What would Elvis have done if he had finally understood the full scope of the theft, the manipulation, and the deliberate harm that was being inflicted on him? Would he have sued Colonel Parker? Would he have fired Dr. Nick? Would he have broken free from the control that was suffocating him? We'll never know because Elvis died before Vernon could present his case. This is where the story becomes truly tragic. Vernon left behind not just evidence, but a blueprint for rescue. He documented exactly what was happening and exactly who was responsible. He preserved information that could have allowed Elvis to break free from the system that was destroying him. But the opportunity was lost. And then the evidence was buried. Now, nearly 50 years later, those documents are starting to resurface. Researchers are uncovering pieces of what Vernon left behind. People who were present when the safe was opened are finally speaking up, and questions are being asked that the Presley family has been avoiding for half a century. What exactly was in Vernon's safe? What documents were destroyed and why? Who authorized the cover-up? And what would Elvis's life have looked like if Vernon's evidence had been acted upon instead of suppressed? Riley Keough, as the current trustee of the Presley estate, now holds the keys to whatever remains of Vernon's documentation. She has access to the safe, she knows what's in the family archives, she understands the implications of what her great-grandfather was trying to preserve, and she faces an impossible choice. She can continue the tradition of silence that has protected her family from legal liability and public scrutiny for 50 years. Or she can finally honor Vernon's dying wish and release the evidence that could fundamentally change how the world understands Elvis's death. The choice she makes will determine whether Vernon's attempt to protect his son succeeds 50 years too late, or whether Elvis's exploitation remains buried with him forever. Vernon Presley died trying to expose the truth. His safe held the evidence, but will Riley finally release it? Will the Presley family finally break their silence? Subscribe now, because what happens next could shake the entertainment industry to its core.
Elvis, the people that he knew before.
There's a man sitting in a quiet room somewhere in Memphis, and he's carrying a burden that's been crushing him for nearly 50 years. His name is Jerry Schilling, and at 79 years old, he's finally decided that staying silent is a luxury he can no longer afford. Because Jerry Schilling wasn't just a friend to Elvis Presley. He was the closest thing Elvis had to a real confidant. He was there when no cameras were rolling. He was there when Elvis was falling apart. He was there during conversations that nobody else was ever supposed to hear. And for decades, he kept his mouth shut. He signed the NDAs. He took the hush money. He looked the other way while the people closest to Elvis systematically destroyed him. But now, with his own mortality staring him in the face, Jerry is done protecting the people who should have protected Elvis instead. The story of Elvis Presley's death has been told 1,000 different ways. Official reports call it a cardiac event brought on by prescription drug use. Doctors blame his weight and his sedentary lifestyle. Some blame his addiction to pills, as if Elvis was somehow uniquely weak compared to everyone else struggling with the same demons. And the Presley family, particularly Priscilla, has spent nearly half a century controlling the narrative, making sure that the most damaging truths stayed buried in Graceland's vaults. But none of those narratives account for what Jerry Schilling actually witnessed. And Jerry's testimony is dangerous, not because it's unbelievable, but because it's credible. He has nothing left to lose. He's 80 years old. He's not looking for money. He's not trying to sell a book or launch a podcast. He's trying to clear his conscience before he dies. And what he's about to say will shatter the carefully constructed mythology that's protected the Presley estate for nearly 5 decades. Jerry didn't become Elvis's friend by chance. He met Elvis in 1954, when they were both young men trying to figure out their place in the world. While everyone else saw a rising star, Jerry saw a person, a lonely person, a person who was desperate for a real friend who didn't want something from him. Their friendship deepened over the years, surviving Priscilla, surviving the military, surviving the Hollywood machine. By the time Elvis reached his final years, Jerry wasn't just a friend. He was a business manager, a bodyguard, a confidant, and arguably the only person in Elvis's life who had no financial stake in his destruction. And that's precisely why Elvis trusted Jerry with secrets that he wouldn't share with anyone else. But here's the thing about keeping secrets for 50 years. The weight of them doesn't get lighter. It gets heavier. Every day that passes, every lie you tell to cover up what you know. Every time you hear someone claim that Elvis's death was an accident and you don't correct them, the guilt accumulates. It crushes you. Jerry has felt that weight for nearly 5 decades. He's watched movies and documentaries that get the story completely wrong. He's read books that perpetuate lies he knows are lies. He's heard people speculate about what really happened on August 16, 1977, and he's never stepped forward to set the record straight. Not because he's a bad person, but because he was scared. Scared of the legal consequences. Scared of losing money. Scared of being sued by the Presley family lawyers. Scared of being shut out of the only world he'd ever known. But fear is a luxury too, and at 79 years old, Jerry's running out of time to indulge it. The man who's about to break his silence isn't a tabloid journalist or a conspiracy theorist trying to sell clickbait. He's an insider with direct access to Elvis during the most critical moments of his life. He has first-hand knowledge of conversations that shaped Elvis's decisions. He knows what Elvis was thinking, what Elvis was feeling, and what Elvis was experiencing in the hours and days before he died. And more importantly, Jerry knows who was helping Elvis and who was hurting him. He knows which doctors were actually trying to save his life and which ones were just writing prescriptions to keep him docile and profitable. He knows which people in Elvis's inner circle genuinely cared about him and which ones were just parasites feeding off his fame and fortune. What Jerry is about to reveal isn't speculation or rumor, it's testimony from someone who was actually there. Someone who knew Elvis's voice, Elvis's mannerisms, Elvis's fears. Someone who heard Elvis talk about his own mortality, his own despair, his own sense that he was trapped and there was no way out. And Jerry's been carrying those conversations around inside his head for 50 years, watching the official narrative of Elvis's death take shape around a lie, unable to do anything about it, because he was trapped by fear and money and the weight of the Presley family's power. But time changes things. Fear loses its grip when you realize you're running out of years to live. Money means less when you know you can't take it with you. And the power of the Presley family, while still formidable, matters less when you've already decided that your conscience is worth more than your comfort. Jerry Schilling has made that calculation. He's decided that the truth about what happened to Elvis is more important than his own financial security or his own reputation or his own comfort in his final years. And he's ready to tell that truth, no matter what the consequences are. The official story of Elvis's final day is clean. It's clinical. According to the medical examiner's report, Elvis woke up on the morning of August 16, 1977, went to the bathroom, and collapsed. His fiancée, Ginger Alden, found him on the floor. Emergency services were called. He was pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital. Cause of death: cardiac arrhythmia. The narrative is simple enough that it fits into a news cycle. Simple enough that it doesn't raise too many uncomfortable questions. But Jerry Schilling was there. He wasn't in that bathroom, but he was in Graceland that morning. He was there the night before. He was there during conversations that nobody outside that house was ever supposed to hear. And the reality of what happened is nothing like the official story. According to Jerry, the final 24 hours of Elvis's life were a cascade of medical emergencies, desperate pleas for help, and deliberate choices by the people around him to ignore every warning sign. Elvis wasn't just sick. He was screaming for someone to save him. And the people closest to him chose not to. Jerry describes a man who was terrified of his own mortality, who knew something was fundamentally wrong with his body, who understood that the pills he was taking were destroying him, and who begged the people he trusted to help him get clean. But instead of getting clean, Elvis got deeper into the cycle. Every time he asked for help, someone in his inner circle found a reason to give him more pills instead. Every time he expressed fear about his health, someone reassured him that everything was fine, while knowing full well that nothing was fine. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now, let's continue. The systemic failure that Jerry describes wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. There were doctors in Elvis's life who had taken an oath to do no harm, but they were writing prescriptions like they were candy dispensers. Dr. Nick Nicopolis, Elvis's personal physician, was pumping him full of medications that had no business being prescribed to a man in Elvis's condition. Uppers in the morning, downers at night, painkillers for injuries that didn't exist, diet pills, sleeping pills, pills for anxiety that the pills themselves were causing. It was a pharmaceutical nightmare, and Dr. Nick was the architect of it. But he wasn't acting alone. He was part of a system where everyone benefited from keeping Elvis medicated and isolated and incapable of making decisions that might disrupt the money flow. Jerry reveals that in those final months, Elvis actually tried to escape that system. He talked about checking himself into a rehabilitation facility. He talked about cutting ties with people who weren't good for him. He talked about getting clean, getting healthy, maybe stepping back from his career and actually living a life instead of performing one. But every time Elvis expressed those desires, someone in his circle sabotaged him. They would tell him he wasn't really addicted, just over-medicated. They would tell him that rehab was unnecessary, that he could manage it on his own. They would tell him that people were trying to exploit him, trying to take advantage of his vulnerability. And gradually, Elvis stopped believing in the possibility of rescue. He stopped believing that he could get better. He stopped believing that anyone actually cared enough about him as a person to help him escape the machine. What makes Jerry's account so devastating is the specificity of it. He describes Elvis in the weeks before his death becoming more paranoid, more isolated, more convinced that the world was against him. And this paranoia wasn't coming from nowhere. It was being actively cultivated by people who had financial incentive to keep Elvis exactly where he was. Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, was draining hundreds of thousands of dollars from Elvis's accounts. Priscilla, his ex-wife, maintained control over major decisions in his life and used that control to keep him dependent and compliant. The entourage, the doctors, the lawyers, everyone who orbited around Elvis had built their lives on his fame and his money. A healthy Elvis who got clean and took control of his own life would have threatened all of that. So nobody wanted him to get healthy. Everybody wanted him to stay exactly as he was. Sick, medicated, manageable, Jerry also reveals something that most people don't know about Elvis's final weeks. He was terrified. Not of death necessarily, but of losing control. He knew his body was failing him. He could feel it. He would talk to Jerry about experiencing chest pains, about his breathing getting shallow, about moments where he felt like his heart was beating irregularly. And every time he mentioned these symptoms, the doctors would just add another medication to the rotation instead of actually addressing what was causing the problems. It was like watching someone slowly drown while people handed them anvils and called it life support. But what really breaks Jerry's heart, what really drives home the guilt he's been carrying, is that he was complicit in this. He was in those rooms. He heard those conversations. He watched Elvis beg for help and watched that help get denied. And he did nothing. He didn't go to the authorities. He didn't call the medical board. He didn't convince Elvis to leave Graceland and check into a real hospital. He stayed quiet because he was scared. Because he was being paid to stay quiet. Because he was trapped in the same system that was killing his best friend. And that's the weight Jerry's been carrying. That's what he needs to say before he dies. Because the official narrative of Elvis's death protects everybody except Elvis. It protects the doctors who overprescribed. It protects the managers who exploited. It protects the family members who stood by and did nothing. And it destroys Elvis all over again by turning his death into an accident instead of what it really was. A preventable tragedy orchestrated by people who loved money more than they loved him. Every system of exploitation needs architects. It needs people at the top who understand how to extract maximum value while maintaining plausible deniability. In Elvis's case, there were 3 architects who Jerry Schilling wants to name before he dies. The first was Colonel Tom Parker, a man so ruthless and so calculated that he made the mafia look like amateur hour. The second was Dr. George Nicopolis, a physician who abandoned his medical ethics the moment he realized how lucrative it could be to keep Elvis addicted. And the third was Priscilla Presley, a woman who maintained iron-fisted control over Elvis's personal life while publicly playing the role of the concerned ex-wife. Colonel Parker wasn't just Elvis's manager. He was the architect of a financial system that funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars away from Elvis and into Parker's own accounts. Jerry describes a man who was absolutely brilliant at one thing: making money. Parker understood that Elvis was a product, and like any product, he needed to be maintained in a specific condition to maximize profit. A healthy, happy Elvis who took control of his own career would have been a disaster for Parker, because that Elvis might have realized how much money he was losing. So Parker made sure Elvis stayed dependent, medicated, and confused about his own financial situation. Jerry reveals that Parker deliberately kept Elvis away from people who might have given him good financial advice. He isolated Elvis from accountants who might have shown him the numbers. He surrounded him with yes men who would never question his authority. And he used Elvis's trust against him, making deals that benefited Parker while claiming they benefited Elvis. But here's what makes Parker's exploitation so sinister. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. Parker understood that if Elvis ever regained clarity, if he ever sat down with a calculator and understood how badly he was being robbed, the jig would be up. So Parker had to keep Elvis confused, keep him medicated, keep him in a state where he couldn't trust his own judgment. And that meant working closely with the doctors who were feeding Elvis pills. Dr. Nick Nicopolis wasn't just some rogue physician operating in isolation. He was part of Parker's system. He was being compensated to keep Elvis medicated. Whether that was explicit or implicit doesn't matter. The result was the same. Elvis had a doctor whose primary obligation was to his employer, not to his patient. Jerry describes Dr. Nick as a man who lost his way. He started out wanting to help Elvis, wanting to manage his pain and his anxiety. But somewhere along the line, he realized that there was more money in enabling Elvis's addiction than in actually treating it. So, he became a pill factory. He would write prescriptions for medications that had no legitimate medical purpose. He would refill prescriptions that should have been stopped months earlier. He would add new medications on top of old ones without considering the interactions or the cumulative effects. And he did all of this while standing at Elvis's bedside, claiming to care about his health. It's one of the most twisted forms of betrayal imaginable. To have someone wearing a white coat, someone with a medical degree, someone you've been trained to trust, actively working to destroy you while telling you it's medicine. The third architect of Elvis's destruction was Priscilla, and this is where Jerry's revelation becomes genuinely explosive. Because Priscilla has spent nearly 50 years positioning herself as the woman who loved Elvis most, the woman who understood him, the woman who was heartbroken by his death. But Jerry's account paints a very different picture. He describes Priscilla as a woman obsessed with control, someone who couldn't stand the idea of Elvis having autonomy or making his own decisions. After their divorce, Priscilla didn't just disappear from Elvis's life. She remained intimately involved in his day-to-day operations. She had input on his career decisions. She influenced who he spent time with. She maintained leverage over him by controlling access to their daughter, Lisa Marie, and she used that leverage to keep him compliant. Jerry reveals that there were moments in Elvis's final years when he wanted to make radical changes. He wanted to leave Memphis. He wanted to break free from the entourage. He wanted to separate from Colonel Parker. He wanted to get clean and rebuild his life. And every single time Elvis expressed those desires, Priscilla would find a way to block him. She would threaten to keep Lisa Marie away from him. She would whisper doubts in his ear about the people trying to help him. She would reinforce the narrative that Elvis couldn't survive without the system that was destroying him. In other words, Priscilla was using emotional manipulation to keep Elvis trapped in the exact same prison that Parker and Dr. Nick were keeping him trapped in through financial and pharmaceutical means. What Jerry is describing is a conspiracy, though not the kind that requires secret meetings or written agreements. It's a conspiracy of incentives. Everyone in Elvis's inner circle had financial or emotional reasons to keep him exactly as he was. Parker made money off him. Dr. Nick made money off him. Priscilla maintained power over him. The entourage depended on him for their livelihoods. The hotel in Las Vegas depended on him for their revenue. The record label depended on him for their profits, and Elvis depended on all of them. He had been made dependent through 1,000 small choices, 1,000 small manipulations, until he couldn't imagine a life that existed outside of their control. Jerry describes one particular conversation with Elvis from just weeks before his death. Elvis was talking about feeling trapped, feeling like he couldn't escape no matter what he did. And Jerry, instead of helping him escape, reassured him that everything would be okay, that the system would take care of him. Jerry enabled him just like everyone else did. And that's what Jerry carries. That's what he needs to confess. Because he wasn't just a witness to the system that killed Elvis. He was a participant in it. And he spent 50 years trying to forgive himself for that. There's a detail that Jerry Schilling has kept locked inside him for nearly 50 years, and it's the kind of detail that changes everything about how we understand Elvis's death. It's not a detail that appears in any medical report. It's not something that the Memphis coroner documented. It's something that Elvis told Jerry in private in a moment of raw honesty when all the walls were down and there was nowhere left to hide. And Jerry needs to say it out loud before he dies, because keeping it secret is a form of lying. And he's done lying. On the night of August 15th, 1977, Jerry was at Graceland. Elvis was in one of his typical late-night states, medicated but restless, tired but unable to sleep, caught in that pharmaceutical purgatory that had become his permanent condition. And in that state, Elvis said something to Jerry that Jerry has never publicly acknowledged. He said, "I can't do this anymore. Not I don't want to do this. Not I'm thinking about stopping." He said, "I can't do this anymore." And he meant it. He meant all of it. The performances, the pretending, the pills, the isolation, the constant surveillance, the loss of his autonomy, the knowledge that every person in his life was profiting from his suffering. Jerry asked Elvis what he meant, and Elvis told him that he'd been thinking about checking into a hospital. Not because he wanted to get better, although part of him did, but because he needed to escape. He needed to get away from Parker, away from the doctors, away from Priscilla, away from everyone who had a claim on him. He needed to be somewhere that he could breathe without permission, somewhere that he could sleep without a pill, somewhere that he could think without someone else's agenda interfering. Elvis was talking about his own life like it was a prison sentence he needed to serve out. And he was asking Jerry for help. Not explicitly, but the request was there in his voice, in his desperation, in the way he was reaching out. Jerry told Elvis that he would help him. He said all the right things. He said that it was a good idea. that getting away would be healthy, that the hospital would give him what he needed. But here's the crucial part, the part that Jerry has been wrestling with for 50 years. Jerry didn't actually do anything. He didn't call a hospital. He didn't research rehabilitation centers. He didn't go to anyone with authority and say that Elvis needed immediate intervention. He went to bed that night thinking that maybe tomorrow he would help Elvis. Maybe tomorrow he would make some calls. Maybe tomorrow he would be the friend that Elvis desperately needed him to be. But tomorrow never came. Because Elvis died in that bathroom on August 16, 1977, and Jerry never got the chance to be that friend. And more importantly, Jerry never got the chance to tell the world what Elvis had actually said, what Elvis had actually wanted, what Elvis had actually been asking for in those final hours. Now here's where the revelation becomes truly devastating. Jerry has evidence that Elvis didn't just collapse accidentally in that bathroom. He has evidence that Elvis was aware of what was happening to him. He had conversations with Elvis about his own mortality, about the way his body was failing, about the specific sense of knowing that something catastrophic was coming. And Jerry believes that Elvis made a choice, not a suicide in the traditional sense, but a choice to stop fighting, a choice to stop taking the medications, a choice to see what would happen if he just let go. This is the part that the Presley estate has worked so hard to keep buried, because it complicates the narrative in ways that create liability. If Elvis deliberately chose not to fight his own death, then questions emerge about whether the people around him tried hard enough to save him. If Elvis was conscious of his own failing health and made decisions based on that consciousness, then the doctors and managers and family members who kept him medicated and isolated become complicit in a way that's harder to defend legally. If Elvis took control of the one thing he had left, which was whether or not he would keep living in a system that had destroyed him, then the entire official narrative of accidental overdose collapses. Jerry describes having a conversation with Elvis days before his death, where Elvis talked about what would happen if he just stopped. If he stopped taking the pills, if he stopped performing, if he stopped pretending. And Elvis said something that Jerry has never forgotten. He said, "Maybe the only way out is to stop fighting." Jerry understood what Elvis meant. He understood that Elvis wasn't talking about suicide in the clinical sense. He was talking about surrender. He was talking about the possibility that the only escape from a life that had become completely unbearable was to simply stop maintaining it. And Jerry believes that's what happened on August 16th. He believes that Elvis, in a moment of clarity or desperation or both, made a conscious decision to stop fighting. Whether that meant deliberately taking a lethal combination of medications, or simply ceasing to take the medications that were keeping him alive, or making some other choice entirely. Jerry doesn't claim to know the specifics, but what Jerry does claim to know is that Elvis was aware of what was happening. Elvis understood the stakes, and Elvis chose. The reason this matters is because it takes away the narrative of accident and replaces it with the narrative of choice. And choice implies agency. And agency implies that Elvis, even in his most broken state, even after decades of manipulation and control, still had power over one fundamental thing, his own life and death. If Elvis took control of the one thing he had left, which was whether or not he would keep living in a system that had destroyed him, then the entire official narrative of accidental overdose collapses. Jerry describes having a conversation with Elvis days before his death, where Elvis talked about what would happen if he just stopped. If he stopped taking the pills, if he stopped performing, if he stopped pretending. And Elvis said something that Jerry has never forgotten. He said, "Maybe the only way out is to stop fighting." Jerry understood what Elvis meant. He understood that Elvis wasn't talking about suicide in the clinical sense. He was talking about surrender. He was talking about the possibility that the only escape from a life that had become completely unbearable was to simply stop maintaining it. And Jerry believes that's what happened on August 16th. He believes that Elvis, in a moment of clarity or desperation or both, made a conscious decision to stop fighting. Whether that meant deliberately taking a lethal combination of medications, or simply ceasing to take the medications that were keeping him alive, or making some other choice entirely. Jerry doesn't claim to know the specifics, but what Jerry does claim to know is that Elvis was aware of what was happening. Elvis understood the stakes, and Elvis chose. The reason this matters is because it takes away the narrative of accident and replaces it with the narrative of choice. And choice implies agency. And agency implies that Elvis, even in his most broken state, even after decades of manipulation and control, still had power over one fundamental thing: his own life and death. That's not a comfortable narrative for the people who profited from Elvis's suffering. That's not a narrative that protects them from liability or from moral judgment. Because if Elvis made a choice, then the people who put him in a position where that choice was his only escape bear some responsibility for that choice. Jerry Schilling is saying that he was part of the system that created the circumstances where Elvis felt like his only option was surrender. He's saying that he saw the suffering and didn't act decisively enough. He's saying that he remained silent for 50 years, partly out of fear, partly out of complicity, and partly because speaking up would have destroyed people he cared about. But at 79 years old, Jerry has decided that silence is a luxury he can no longer afford. The truth about what happened to Elvis, the full truth, the complicated truth that involves choice and desperation, and a man who was trying to escape a life that had become unsustainable, that truth belongs to the world. And Jerry is finally ready to tell it. Jerry Schilling's confession could rewrite everything we thought we knew about Elvis's final days. But will the Presley family lawyers allow this testimony to become public? Will the truth ever see a courtroom? Subscribe now and hit the bell, because what happens next will shock you.